and welcome to another episode of the Get Psyched show. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Alban Dickson. We firstly discuss Alban's pathway to becoming an accredited sports psychologist and the challenges that involved. We then moved on to chat about his role as a performance psychologist at a Scottish Premiership club. I love this section as it gives a behind the scenes and insight into the day-to-day operations of how players and coaches interact with a psychologist. Alban is also currently completing a PhD where he is studying the psychosocial development in youth football and the ways in which sports psychology can become a more prevalent and integrated part of youth football through a variety of mediums. Finally, Alban has also found the time in the last few years to get involved with the British Psychological Society, or the BPS, and we got to chat through his roles with them, as well as hosting the annual conference last year in Edinburgh and all that entailed. If you do enjoy, please share the episode with someone you might think would enjoy it too, and leave a review if you can. Thank you. Hi Alban, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks George. Doing well, yeah. A nice sunny day here in Scotland, and I imagine it's nice weather where you are too.
Yeah, it's not too bad over here. A wee bit windy, but still plenty of sun out. Thank you for joining me today for today's episode. I'm really looking forward to this with your past experience, and we're going to dive a lot into that later. But could you just give me sort of a brief overview of your career so far, I guess, from the moment you left school to what you went on to go and do, and I guess up to the position you're in now?
You've put your foot in it there right at the start, because, and this is a fact that most of my close friends know, a lot of other people don't know, I never actually went to school as such. So if we talk about education, that's going to be a very convoluted path. But yeah, I guess my career, by the time I left university, I worked a bit in the third sector. I worked a bit in music. I then ended up working at the University of Stirling in a handful of different roles, really. And it was about that point I actually turned and kind of decided to focus on sports psychology. So yeah, a few kind of twists and turns along the way. And I guess where I'm at just now is I work part-time. I'm a performance psychologist in a professional football club environment. I'm also a PhD student working on a project with an industry partner, which is really exciting. And I still do little bits of consultancy and like some mental health training in the little free time that I find that I have after you deduct everything else that's going on.
Awesome, good stuff. So you did your undergraduate degree in psychology, I believe. Why did you decide to do that? Why did you decide to study psychology?
Yeah, again, it's a good question. And I think a lot of us, when we're that age, we probably don't know exactly what we're choosing and why. My circumstances, I was relatively young when I started, and it was kind of just through clearing, really. Psychology was one of the subjects that I had studied at higher level. And so when it came to, right, what am I going to do after completing these qualifications? I was like, well, that's one that I've kind of connected with, despite these really broad brush strokes of a bit of developmental, a little bit of social. Thought, well, actually, this is a subject that I can connect with. It gets me interested, so why not commit to, sticking it out for 4 years? And I guess at that point at the University of Stirling, I took in other modules in biology and law to kind of give myself a little bit of wiggle room, because I thought, well, the good thing about Stirling at that point certainly was it was quite modular, so you could pick and choose. And I thought, well, if it turns out that actually I really like biology, then I could, switch over to that as a main focus. But I stuck with psychology, so that's kind of how I ended up on this kind of slightly erratic journey.
Yeah, good stuff. I think that's one of the things with psychology. I remember when I did higher psychology as well. I mean, going into my undergraduate, and I was quite keen on doing it, but it is a bit daunting. But there's so many different sort of avenues with it that you can be like, I find it interesting, but I'm not sure quite what section that I have my passion for. And you do some things, you're like, this is really boring, and then other things where it's like, this is so exciting. I can see the relevance of this. So yeah, I think that's sort of maybe a daunting thing coming into doing psychology.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real double-edged sword in that respect. I would say exactly the same. The benefit is you can apply it in just about any career, any job. If it's a case of you need a degree to enter a graduate program, psychology really does tick a lot of boxes. But that's also the downside, because if you want to pursue something, you really have to take that extra commitment to specify and kind of like go, right, this is the channel that I want to chase down. So yeah, definitely there are pros and cons. I mean, it's modern day philosophy in action, really. So it covers just about everything to do with the human existence. But yeah, likewise, there's some modules in amongst cognition, animal psychology, but didn't really connect with me quite so much. And then you're kind of questioning your choices at that point.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And as you said, now you're working in professional football in that environment and a very sport focused environment. Have
Mm-hmm.
you always sort of been in? Have you had your head in sport? Has that always been your passion, especially football, or was there sort of a moment where you went, right, sport is where I feel like I can make a difference and where my passion lies?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to wind the clock back a bit with that as well. I never really kind of, at the point of doing my undergrad, I never really thought like sports psychology is for me. I do remember vaguely, learning a bit about social psychology and at that time applying it to my observations of going to football matches. I supported a local team growing up and was a season ticket holder. And some of those things around conformity and, what you'd later understand as kind of, basking in kind of collective glory and stuff like all of that really came to life as a follower of a football team. But it was probably towards the end of my university career I started coaching, and then some years later, that's when it kind of the penny dropped, and I thought, right, okay, yeah, this is kind of beginning to make sense. Some of what I've learned years ago now kind of helps me understand the population I'm coaching and the players that I'm working with at this moment. So yeah, the short of it is football has been that kind of consistent thread in my life. I've never played to a high standard. I actually probably played recreationally quite late. I still play it. It's a great way of maintaining one's well-being and just letting out a bit of frustration at the end of a week or something. But yeah, football kind of it's been there kind of throughout my life, and there's definitely an interesting crossover with psychology and football that really does come to life. And yeah, I think it's kind of a bit of destiny, hopefully, that I find myself in this position of being able to work at a good level as part of a really effective interdisciplinary team.
Yeah, excellent. And I think that example is such a good one of that passion that you have of something in, I guess, your personal life, something you just do for enjoyment, and then getting that connection with something you've learned and seeing that crossover and putting two and two together and realize, right, there's something I can do here, which is
Yeah.
which is awesome to hear, and sort of a similar path that I've gone down of loving
Mm-hmm.
sport and then finding, right, psychology actually has a place in sport as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
on your path over, you're in a really good position right now. Has there been sort of a barrier or things in your way that's been really difficult to overcome? Maybe a challenge that's been there or that's been consistent that you've maybe had to work around or is relevant in this field of sports psychology?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I think it's an important point for us to be aware of, especially when we're embarking on some of those career paths. To me, I think that the biggest barrier was time, really. And as someone who, perhaps like yourself, has spent a large amount of their time volunteering, when I decided I wanted to pursue sports psychology, again, there's that opportunity or almost an expectation, okay, give up some time, immerse yourself in these environments, and that's where opportunities will begin to present themselves. However, at that point, I was already a mature student when I did my MSc, and by the time I was undertaking the qualification in sport exercise psychology, I had a son as well. So time really was a bit of a restriction on what I could or could not do. So that was a really kind of tricky barrier to try and balance. How can I attain all the hours, the experience, the networks that you really need to do, and as I say, are expected to acquire during your kind of training years, whilst also looking after myself, being able to take the responsibilities and roles that I had outside of my sports psychology domain. So yeah, that was probably the most challenging thing, and I wish I had a good solution for it. I think ultimately it's just about trying to be selective. Make sure you find opportunities that are a really good fit, that appreciate you, that don't expect you to just give up your time for absolutely nothing, but will instead give you support and make sure it's kind of a formative opportunity. So yeah, that's probably my little soapbox piece in terms of, you need experience to get experience in the sports psychology world.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that. Yeah, it's an interesting one, and finding those right opportunities can be hard because, as you say, you need that initial experience for someone to say, right, we'll take you on. So it's that balance between sort of, right, do I just go for this because it's an opportunity, or do I hold out for the right one? But yeah, that idea of balancing is very true. And no matter, I guess, your situation may be slightly different to other people doing it, but everyone's got that thing that comes up or the thing that's going alongside of what they're trying to do. So yeah, it's a good point and something that I'm sure everyone would understand. We're
Yeah.
going to come on to your role currently in professional football in a second, but
Hmm.
just going a sort of a step after your undergraduate and then before this role in professional football, what was your pathway to becoming an accredited sports psychologist? How did that look like, and what did you do to achieve that?
Yeah, I was fortunate in that when I decided I wanted to do my master's degree, that I had the flexibility from work. So when was it, around 2016, I started the master's program. I was in full-time employment on campus, and that's when it kind of felt to me as if, well, if you're going to do some further study, now would be the good time, the best time to do it. So I was really fortunate in that initially I got that flexibility to go off and attend classes. And then as my roles changed in that full-time employment, it became a little bit more sport-focused, which then allowed for quite a neat crossover where if I was doing, activities X, Y, and Z, they actually helped tick some of the boxes in the qualification of sport and exercise psychology. So 2018, having worked through the master's program part-time for a couple of years, I signed up for the British Psychological Society's route. At that time, it really was a choice between BPS route, or you could go off into a professional doctorate, which I wasn't really in a position to commit to. So I did the BPS route for the sort of flexibility that it offered, and just started trying to build up my hours. So it was little bits of work that I could do as part of my 9 to 5, what I could do in evenings and weekends, and just kind of like trying to build it up from there. So I spent 3 years doing that, doing the what's called QSET, which, yeah, was obviously an interesting time too. A lot of that was done in lockdown, and I was very fortunate again to be in a position where I was furloughed, so I could still have a bit of income coming in, but also spend a bit of my time on just creating short videos, again, connecting and supporting athletes remotely, and just trying to continue building up my CPD as well. So, I'm not sure I would recommend my pathway, but you just you try and work with the hand that you're dealt with, and I was definitely very fortunate to have some support from people who empathise my position and were happy to try and accommodate me.
Yeah, excellent. And just to point out to listeners, I spoke in the last episode to a guy called Gareth who spoke about sort of the pathways to become a sports psychologist. So if you want to sort of go into a bit more detail about that, I definitely recommend listening to that, and then you might have a bit more idea what Alban's speaking about. But yeah, that sort of 3 year standard pathway after you've done your masters to do that. And I think the point you made about the hand you're dealt is so true, and you use that opportunity when you have that extra time during COVID to get those hours sorted, and I guess you're reaping the rewards now because of it.
Yeah, I've had a lot of conversations with people who, again, the beauty of going into any profession really is the diversity of it. And I know there are people who have come from academy experiences or have been performing at on world stage, and then decide, okay, I want to actually, rather than going into coaching, I want to do sports psychology, and they can make it work. Likewise, there's people who perhaps like me are not really proficient at any one sport to that degree, just have a passion for the subject and for working with people. So yeah, I think it's important that we recognise that it doesn't really matter what your circumstances are, as long as you're able to adapt, and as long as you can find a way, then you can create your own path, forge your own path as you kind of work your way through everything.
Yeah, and I guess, do you find it useful networking with people who have come from that different experiences as a way of developing your idea and an approach to how you practice sports psychology? So speaking with someone who's maybe a former professional athlete, you can see how they see things differently, or an approach that you get a different idea of what they're coming at from because of their past experiences.
Yeah, I think it's one way of combating that imposter syndrome, isn't it? Often, the first time you have a conversation with somebody, those little thoughts sink in a little bit, and you might go, oh my goodness, they're way ahead of me. They've got such a bigger network, and they've got, all this lived experience that they must be able to use. But then you talk to somebody else, and you talk to somebody else, talk to somebody else, and then you realize actually everyone has their own strengths, they have their own weaknesses as well, and then you kind of see how you can fit in with that too. So whilst it's a bit daunting to begin with, yeah, definitely, I think connecting and making sure your network is broad is a really nice way of extinguishing some of these self-doubts and self-criticisms that you might harbour.
Yeah, excellent. Good stuff. Thank you for that. We'll move on now to, I guess, your current role as a performance psychologist, working in professional football. So could you give us sort of a description of the current role you're in and some of the examples of the day-to-day work you're doing in this position?
Yeah, so my applied work just now, my current role is with the title of performance psychologist. I'm very fortunate to be working in a professional football environment that has not only a men's team performing at the highest level in the country, but also a women's team comparably performing in the very top tier. So those are two fantastic populations that I get to work with. Across my 2 days, it varies from week to week. There's often a little bit of reactivity of trying to figure out what's happened in the week or the weekend before, and then trying to make sure that I'm around and available at the best times. But in terms of activities that I do, it's fairly consistent. A bit of a fruit salad of one-to-one engagement with players. That tends to be the first thing that I try to factor in, in terms of which days I'm going to be in, and that will cover a range of different bases. One of the things that I like to try and put across really early into a working relationship is that psychology is not when everything else hits the fan. It's not when things are going bad. It's also about maintaining, improving, building on really good performance levels as well. So in that respect, I think it's quite nice that my title is performance psychologist, because we're talking about performance, and it kind of loosens off some of those associations people have with psychologist equals mental health or sports psychologist equals crisis. So one-to-ones is a big part of what I do. Also doing group workshops. That again varies. I think the key is brevity. So especially working with the men's first team, it tends to be a case of very short, illustrative visuals. So using video clips, using examples, trying to stimulate a bit of discussion, but 10, 15 minutes max. With the women's squad, it tends to be a little bit longer, so we might be able to break the groups into little subgroups for discussion, put a few more novel activities in there as well. So they are quite different little ecosystems, if you like, the men's and the women's side. So there's that group level workshop as well. And then the other parts that I really enjoy are, a little bit of CPD, so working with coaches at academy level, working with the MDT team in order to try and share the insights into my domain, my field. Also working with coaches as much as possible as well. And I think also just trying to kind of record and celebrate some of what you're doing as well, create systems in place to be able to kind of monitor, create resources as well, which might be going out to different populations. So yeah, hopefully that covers a little bit of how I try and spend my time.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, it gives a really good overview, and I've got quite a few questions about that.
Brilliant.
Just as you said, I think on that mindset of psychology being like a reactive approach, I always think of it like an S&C coach. We athletes do strength and conditioning to prevent injury and to sort of build strength to get better. So why are we not looking at psychology like the same way, where even if we're performing well, let's prevent getting to a stage where there might be a problem, and how can we better our performance at the same time?
Yeah, there's a nice association there as well with, so my primary model is acceptance and commitment therapy, which centres around the notion of psychological flexibility. So exactly like you say, George, I try and put that across to athletes in the terms of it's about being flexible. It's about, in the same way you want your body to be flexible to a degree, you want to be mentally flexible, psychologically flexible, so that if something unexpected happens, if you're in a situation that is unusual, then you can adapt, you can deal with it as it comes your way.
Excellent. And that leads quite nicely into my next question. So obviously you've just sort of spoken about your philosophy, your approach to your practice. Did you find that when you came into the club that was this is sort of your role, you're given the reins, you take it as your approach, or did the club come at you with, this is what we're thinking, this is our maybe previous experience with psychology, we'd like you to go down this route, or was it sort of given over to you?
I think what the club did well was they advertised the post, and unfortunately, in terms of working in sport, often it is a case of who you know. And sometimes with that, there comes maybe a lack of clarity as to what your expectations are and where you fit into a structure. So I actually would commend them on having a set role that they recruited for with respect to the psychological provision. I think that was a really good starting point. I was also fortunate, I guess, in that there was someone who's previously been doing that role for, I think, some 12 months before I came into post. So there was a little bit of a footprint there. We weren't, I don't think, identical practitioners, but there was a crossover, and I was able to have a bit of a sort of a handover after I was, in the role for a few weeks. I was able to kind of connect with them online and understand a little bit about, again, kind of work that we've done and future directions as well. But yeah, I suppose going back to your question, in terms of the expectation, there's a bit of an understanding as to where psychology could fit in across the kind of wider staff role, but also with the coaches and to a degree with the players as well. So that was helpful. But equally, you want to sort of put your own approach across. And so, especially with the men's first team, it wasn't really until my first pre-season that I was able to sit down individually with them one-to-one and say, here is my understanding of how we could work together. Here's a bit of a flavour of the kind of conversations we would have. And for me, that was a really important exercise because it allowed me to kind of give a sample, a free sample, if you like, of this is a conversation. This isn't, a lecture. This isn't about me telling you, you need to fix this. It wasn't prescriptive. So it really allowed people to kind of sit in with, okay, this is what sports psychology or what performance psychology is going to feel like. So I think that was a really key part as well in terms of setting expectations for the players.
Yeah, excellent. And I think that point of pre-season as well is I guess the most crucial part, because that's when players have got more time, players are under less pressure, and they've got that mindset as well where new season, new start, I want to look at how I can build. So all those things coming together, I guess, that gives you a really good base to move forward.
Yeah.
With working with players, obviously, as you said, you've got the men's and women's first teams, and there'll be, there could be a 15, 20-year age gap between players in there. Do you find quite a difference, quite a range in the reception of your work depending on the characteristics of players? So depending if they're male or female, the sort of age, maybe if they've come from abroad, lived abroad, or if they've always lived and worked in Scotland. Do you find a difference in how they take the approach, or is just every player a bit different?
I think, as you say, every player is a little bit different. Sometimes there are little trends that you can pick up on, but then we also don't want to make any assumptions either. So one of the obvious reflections that comes to my mind is the difference between the men and the women. But I think to understand how my engagement differs with both those groups, you have to look at the kind of bigger picture. And for the men's side, professional football is long established. Most of those players have been through some kind of academy system and are used to a range of different disciplines at their disposal to support them. Whereas on the women's side, the team are going through that transition, and indeed women's football in Scotland is going through that professionalism just now. So for a lot of them, it's new to have access, not just to myself, but to even an S&C coach, to nutritionists, to other people with kind of expertise around performance. And I think the result of that is, I've certainly found generally a lot of women are quite open-minded to, okay, let's engage with the different experts that are in the building. What can I take and what can I use to try and make the most of this opportunity, which is obviously really refreshing and really enjoyable from my perspective too. But the flip side of that is I would never make an assumption that just because someone has been in the women's game, they are going to be absolutely desperate to kind of engage with me or engage with anyone else. Again, it differs. It's just an interesting landscape at the moment of, okay, that there's that shift from players having to juggle, having to effectively play at amateur level, having to be second fiddle in terms of getting access to facilities and so on, where we're now hopefully going towards a much more equal model in terms of what's available to them, what resources that they have as well. The other point which came to mind when you're talking, I sometimes think with age, younger players can be really engaged with this sort of thing, perhaps just a generational factor, but equally a lot of more mature players have also kind of been through it, and they've seen their own ups and downs and reflected on that and thought, yeah, you know what, why don't I want to try and make the most of nutrition or psychology or whatever else is available to me? But I think culturally it's really interesting too. Again, hard to we want to avoid stereotypes, so we can't just assume that somebody is going to be more receptive because they've come from a country with a really well-fashioned sports psychology component in academy pathways. But the thing that comes to my mind is that a lot of my work, again, using acceptance commitment therapy, I focus a lot on language and a lot on metaphor, and sometimes that doesn't really translate well. So I need to be aware of that, and I need to adapt, in the same way that you might want to adapt to different populations and other fronts. I can't just assume that something I would say to one player is necessarily going to translate, in context or culturally to somebody else from a completely different part of the globe.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a really interesting point, and it comes on to my next question as well around
Mm-hmm.
this idea that you've got players who are maybe got different appetites for learning about this, and with your restricted time, obviously working only 2 days a week, and that's split up between a huge amount of people. There's a phrase that is often used. It's feed the hungry. So the people that really want to learn, put your time and effort into them. But do you have ways of sort of engaging or pushing it a bit more and trying to encourage players who maybe seem a bit reluctant or a bit unsure? Maybe players who English might be a second language, so another sitting in a room listening to someone is just a straight switch off because they've used up so much energy already that day in a team meeting trying to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
So do you have sort of methods or ways to bring those players in and get them engaged a wee bit more?
Yeah, I think a lot of that really depends on your own personality. And we talk a lot about your philosophy of practice and your applied models and stuff, but ultimately your personality is pretty fixed as well, and in some respects I'm a bit of an extrovert, in some ways I'm a bit of an introvert, and I don't necessarily want to change who I am entirely in that, in a different context. For me, that would be going against some of the authenticity that I hope to present. So actually, I think the short answer to what you've posed there, George, is patience, I think, is really important. And that's something which I've tried to be quite aware of throughout all this. I'm aware that, on paper, you could look at it and think, right, that's a player who's about to go through a 9-month injury rehabilitation. They must be a priority. But equally, if I go and speak to them the week after they've just started their rehab program, they might not be at all interested in it. So for me, it's sometimes just biding my time, being present and being patient. So being kind of visible, being around the different parts of that training environment. So, when players come in for breakfast, kind of being around there, saying hellos, being in the rehab gym, being pitch side, being at matches, all of that forms this idea of being present so that players associate me with all the different facets of performance in their time at the club, but also being patient and not kind of trying to jump on somebody. Maybe that's just my personality and my style, but I just don't think that's necessarily going to hit home. I want players to feel as though they can come to me, and I will reach out and I will invite people to connect, and I will appreciate their honesty in response to that. But yeah, I think being patient is just really important because, as psychology tells us, somebody's far more likely to follow through on something if it's done on their own volition, if they feel they've had some autonomy and made that choice of, actually, yeah, you know what, I am finding things a bit tricky just now, so this would be a good time for me to try and, equip myself as best as possible with a long time on the sidelines.
Yeah, definitely, and I guess it's that authentic approach, as you said, where and being part of a setup like you are as well, where it's sort of you're there a lot of the time. Players get to recognise your face, know who you are, know your name, build that relationship, and trust can build over time rather than it being right. We've got this consultant and he's a psychologist. Tell him all your problems and he'll try and fix them. It's a more natural relationship approach. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I guess as well, you're not just working with players, you're also working, as you said, with coaches and other staff. What is your relationship, I guess, with the backroom staff, with other management, whether it's the gaffer, I guess you call it in football, assistant manager, physios, S&Cs? Are you talking with them, relaying with players, checking in on things, or is it very just they come in, sort of do their psychology stuff and that's it?
Yeah, to me, the most important thing with it is buy-in. And I always get reminded of when I first did my MSc research project, and a short anecdote, going in, I think we were at Inverclyde, Sports Scotland, going in to speak to a squad of football players. And the first thing that happened as I opened my mouth was that the coaching staff left the room, which I felt represented a sense of, well, this stuff isn't as important, we're off. And it was quite an obvious that was them leaving. And so, to me, since that point, I've always been very keen to get that buy-in from coaches. And so if I'm delivering presentations, especially the first few times, I want coaches to be present. I want them to also listen and hear what I've got to say, so that might spark new ideas and further conversations. Obviously, love collaborating and co-creating content with coaches. But equally, I think it's an important symbol to the players that this stuff is important, that, as you say, the gaffer is in attendance or the gaffer is participating actively in this, rather than being seen to be kind of siloed off into somewhere else. Hopefully that makes sense. In terms of how I work with coaches and with staff, I guess there's two parts there. I think the staff team that I'm part of is great. I think it's a very kind of, I would probably describe it as quite high fidelity. I think there's good credibility in that everything that we do is based on research. It's quite a research heavy group, I would say, which I think is really important, because that, again, ties into my philosophy, way of practice, creates a sense of respect that hopefully we all have for each other's positions, and clarifies some of that understanding as to what somebody may or may not do, or what we can or cannot do. In terms of working with coaches, I think it has to be a two-way street, and again, thinking of some of my recent examples, it works quite well that way. I like being able to have a sense of freedom to say, look, how about we do something on this topic in this month, and then in a couple of weeks we'll do something on this topic and then this topic. But equally, I really like it when a coach would say, even just something casual like, what can you do around, pressure, or what can you do around, time kind of game management or something like that, whatever is in their language, so I can then try and translate that and find something I can present back to meet that need. So yeah, I think that two-way street is really important, so that there's the freedom for me to kind of drive things forward and deliver stuff off my own back, but equally I can get suggestions, requests, and I can manage and weave that into everything else that we're doing.
Yeah, awesome. It's almost problem solving, isn't it? Coach coming with you with this idea, and you using your skills and your knowledge to figure out how best to approach it. And as I said before, I think having that alignment and being involved in the setup and that regular dialogue and building that relationship with those around you, it becomes a lot easier to do those things, and the buy-in, I guess, is so important.
Yeah.
Sort of to conclude on, I guess, this area and your role, you've given so much detail and insight into what it's like, into what you do, which is amazing.
Cool.
Your hopefully these opportunities are going to become sort of more, and as we've seen over the last 10 years, I guess sports psychology has become sort of a must-have in any professional performance setup. So how do you see, firstly, this role developing in the current club you're working at? Do you see it becoming a bigger role, maybe more staff or more hours? And then secondly, what's the sort of state of sports psychology in professional football in Scotland at the moment? Is it something that's growing rapidly, or is it taking time to trickle down from the top?
Yeah, I think there's loads there, especially in the second part of that. I think, to me, the first comment that comes to my mind is, we're looking at ways that we can try and enhance that access to sports psychology in the club environment. So hopefully, not too far down the line, we'll be able to offer more for younger players coming through. And I think that's important, not just to make sure that they feel well supported, but also to help with that transition into a more professional environment as well. If your level of support is at this level, relatively low at the point you're in an under-18s group, and suddenly it gets jacked right up to, okay, now you've got loads of different people that you need to form working relationships with, and loads of different insight for you to take on board. That can be quite a stark leap. So I think it's good to try and make that a graded kind of acceleration towards hopefully what will be successful careers for young players coming through. Obviously, there's a really important aspect there around just supporting younger players too, and enhancing their well-being and so forth. So I think that's one of the areas for expanding the provision of psychology in any club really, and also hopefully, whilst staying within our lane, being able to inform things like the culture, the environment, the coaching practices as well. Again, I'm not an expert on coaching. I have a very kind of minimal background and qualification in coaching football, so I'm never going to try and overstep that line. But I like to have good critical conversations with people so we can explore ways that we could integrate a little bit of psychology into coaching practices and so forth. I think your second question is more about sort of the bigger picture. I'm not sure how much authority I really have to speak on that. I think we've obviously had, I think, just over 10 years of the EPPP, which is that four-cornered approach in England of focusing on the technical, tactical and psychological elements for developing young players. And I think that's it's good. It's good to have that there, but obviously the reality can vary, and the reality across clubs can vary. And there are different expectations depending on the category of a football academy as well. So we're moving in the right direction. I think it's always possible that we need to kind of keep on our toes with those things. 10 years is a long time for a strategy to be sitting around. So there's ways that we can maybe sort of replenish that or interpret it differently in Scotland as well. So I think that's maybe one area for improvement is, okay, well, what is the expectation? What's the minimum operating standard of doing sports psychology going to be at for, footballers and academies in Scotland? So it's really good to see a bit of psychology come into the coaching pathway as well. I know it's been there again for some time, but ultimately it's just a handful of hours compared to, other areas which get a lot more attention. So I think we want to really make sure that psychology is part of that expectation of CPD as well. It's almost ironic because every match report, every commentary you listen to, especially in football and for me in Scottish football, people will talk about confidence and motivation, those kind of top level concepts, or they'll talk about dealing with mistakes or coping with expectation and pressure. So it's part of our lexicon, it's part of our language that we have around football and performance, and yet it's not something that we spend an awfully long time refining or developing.
Yeah, I love that point because I've thought the same thing, that you see so much or hear so much commentators who have played at the top level talking about, he's not confident, or he's overthought that pass, or he's lost his focus there, and then there's no sort of, well, what can we do to improve that? It's just like, well, that just is either it happens or it doesn't. Whereas if someone was getting injured a lot, or if someone kept making the same mistake, it's like, well, what's the manager doing, or what's the doctors doing? So it's such a, and there's a fix there. There's things that can help improve it, but it's just realizing that get them involved in it, and it will make a change. Excellent. Coming on, I guess you've spoken about this work in academies, and I guess that brings us nicely onto your PhD work. So could you just explain a little bit about your doctorate that you're doing, your current stage that you're at with it, and sort of, I guess, what it entails?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm very fortunate. I was working, again, full-time. I just come to end of the qualification, and I was kind of looking for what I could do to try and streamline myself around sports psychology. So an opportunity of working with an industry partner and doing a PhD over a few years came up, just a nice time for me. So the focus of that is all around psychosocial development of young footballers. Again, I think it's always nice to highlight that my applied work at the moment is predominantly working at a first team level. So this kind of, although it's football and it clicks together nicely, it's also got a little bit of variety, which is good as well. So working with this partner in order to try and understand a bit more about what is psychosocial development, how can we instill it, how can we facilitate that to happen at football across levels. And I think that was something which is important to me, is a lot of research, probably through convenience, is based in academies, and there's loads of really great work that gets celebrated there, but also huge number of people participate at grassroots level. So can we find something a bit more universal? How can we support the development of young footballers, whether you're playing on a grass pitch with your local community team, or whether you're part of an academy and you're training 5 days a week? There are similar benefits to both, and there are also differences between them. So I think it's really important that we don't exclude one massive part of that puzzle, if you like. So that's where we're at. I'm about 2 years into that just now. So we've got hopefully one paper heading towards being published quite soon. Other studies ongoing, collecting data and everything else. So it's really interesting to be a part of. And I guess trying to hopefully add something else to that picture. The ultimate goal is we're going to try and understand, okay, how can we pull together the learning from various different studies into delivering sports psychology in quite a neat way. And one of the ways that we're exploring is how can we use hybrid learning platforms to support that development. So I guess in a kind of summary format, let's say we know that self-regulation is a really important attribute of a young footballer. That's great. Chances are they're not going to get sports psychology provision every day for a year in order to try and refine that. We're not going to maybe get a one-to-one session once a year or something. So more realistically, you might have a group level workshop that happens. So then what can we do between those contact points in terms of using some online or some kind of technologically based platforms to help foster that sense of self-regulation. So hopefully that makes sense, George, but I'm sure you've got some questions to drill into it in more detail.
Yeah, no, excellent. And I think just mainly from my point of view, the fact that you're focused on grassroots as well as academies is so crucial, because it's a part of sport where I think doesn't get sort of tapped into enough, and especially sports psychology is such a top-down thing where it's elite level get sort of access to it, and there's no sort of perceived access at a really low level in a lot of cases. So that's really good to hear. Yeah, lots of questions. Firstly, I think the as you mentioned earlier about sort of involving psychology and coaching, is this something that you see as maybe putting a bit of that psychology stuff into coaching would benefit as well, and help sort of progress this idea of being able to implement more regular social contact with, or psychology contact with players?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I've said this to coaches that I've worked with before, I think the best way of doing sports psychology is integrating it into practice. It's little conditions, debriefs that you can put into a training session that's really important. It's the little bits of homework. It's obviously the way that a coach conducts themselves and interacts with players. That is really how sports psychology can make a difference to player development. So I think that's a really exciting and important thing that we should be focusing on. Some of the examples that come to my mind is, okay, you put in a couple of little conditions where there's an overload or there are decisions going against one team. Okay, ask players afterwards, what did it feel like? Did you notice your attention going when the coach was deliberately making the wrong call as the referee, or when you realised that you had the upper hand and there's a bit of social loafing going on? So I think reflection is really important. I then think you don't want to lecture young footballers, but you want to illustrate and paint pictures for them. That's a real coaching term, painting a picture, isn't it? So, in terms of, is psychology observable in football? Absolutely. I think there's loads of times I can see a player that struggled to self-regulate in a match. So, even if it's something like, I want you to watch Match of the Day and pick out one clip or two clips of somebody clearly struggling with self-regulation. Oh, well, when that guy kicked the ball away, or when he kicked the goalpost, or when he lay with his head in his hands after missing a chance. Right, great. There's some talking points. So stuff like that, I think, is really key for putting sports psychology into action. Much more effective than me, standing there for an hour and doing a workshop with players. Get them to take a bit of ownership, use little bite-sized interactions, encourage them to reflect and to log, their own experiences and what they're observing. Again, hoping some of that makes sense to you, George, but that's the kind of direction I'd like to move towards. Not quite my own redundancy, but, I think the psychologist should be very much trying to work through other channels and obviously through coaches as well.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's really clear. I guess as well, what sort of age groups are you working with this? Obviously, it's younger players, so you sort of a 16 plus. I know ethics might be a bit of a problem, or are you working with a slightly younger demographic?
Yeah, well, so far in terms of the research, we've been interacting with coaches, and the next kind of current study ongoing is working with people with experiences of using hybrid learning. So it's more of a pedagogical kind of approach. We haven't done anything directly with players just now, but it's a good point you make. What constitutes a young player? In some of the literature, you're talking about under 12s, which you could almost argue is maybe even too young to be trying to do some of this stuff. They should really just be playing and enjoying the game, surely. Equally, there's other papers who would consider that under 25s are young people, So lots of different approaches to that. And again, it's perhaps difficult to try and find, okay, what's universal between a 14-year-old in an academy level and a 17-year-old playing in a grassroots club environment. But that's ultimately what we're trying to work towards, trying to figure out, okay, what are some of when I say universal, what are the real top level things that we should and could be doing to try and support player development?
Excellent. And are you looking at, as well as sort of a maybe more shorter term or career football focused and performance focused approach, are you looking at a wider sort of personal development approach as well, or is it very focused just on the sort of performance?
Yeah, if I'm followed correctly, your question, which I think is really good, I think ultimately everything that we do in the football setting should be applicable outside of football as well. And again, I think of that and I use that a lot when I'm doing some of my own kind of private consultancy work. It's about the stuff that we're doing here shouldn't just be limited to what happens on or off the pitch or the golf course or the tennis court or whatever. It should be about, okay, developing ways of noticing your internal experiences, being able to sort of pick out what is a helpful or an unhelpful thought, being able to sort of analyse your own behaviours and go, right, was that a helpful way that I've dealt with that situation or an unhelpful way? I'm a big believer in values work as well. Understand yourself as a person. Use that to figure out, again, the choices that you need to make in the sport context, but also to understand what's meaningful and important to you outside of sport. And the two of those cross over massively as well. So to try and come full circle with that, I think, good sports psychology provisions aren't just about, and I'm going to try and use a cliche here, it isn't just about using imagery to imagine launching your golf ball landing on the green. It's about doing a very wide range of different activities and developing a lot of skills that we might even consider to be skills, things like noticing and reflecting, so that we can enhance ourselves as people.
Okay, so you've given us loads of detail about sort of what the study's about, what you're hoping to try and find. But as a result of the findings and considering sort of the outcomes, what could the future implications be from what you find, whether it's sort of work with the SFA, more sort of changing standards within grassroots and academy levels, or offering resources? What could those outcomes and implications be like?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think it gets quite exciting, and obviously this is why there's an industry partner on board as well. I guess my vision for it is that, again, by talking to football coaches, by speaking with people who have experience of doing pedagogy and working with hybrid approaches in different contexts, and also probably doing a bit of kind of piloting this in the final stage of the research project. Where I think that takes us is hopefully an understanding of how can we do sports psychology in a modern way. And I often, talk about things like Duolingo, for example. You've got a really nice, neat little app there. Yeah, it's evolved a little bit, but the general principle is kind of daily little bursts of doing something. Loads of gamification in there. It makes it fun. There's a social element because you're sometimes competing against your friends or with other people. How can we sort of translate sports psychology into that kind of domain, which I think is what would be really cool. I'll try and think of a different example, but also something that I'm important in. So let's take resilience as a real kind of buzzword. So again, rather than someone having 1 hour, lesson on what is resilience, let's break that up. There's maybe a touch point where the concept's introduced to them. Then there's maybe an online platform or something where they can look at clips of resilience in action, or where they can reflect on, okay, in the past week, here are 3 occasions where I developed or managed to display resilience. Here's a situation where I might have been able to display resilience. So kind of taking a concept and really just spreading it out into those little kind of bite-sized pieces, so that hopefully what can happen is young players can continue developing. It doesn't have to be for the grassroots player who's maybe only training once or twice a week. It's not taking away any of that time. It's something they can do in their own time at home. And for the academy player, for example, or perhaps a more professional setup, it means they're getting that input, and again, it's on demand. It's something which is accessible for them, something that they can kind of relate to with their peers as well. And again, just making it fun, engaging, interactive as well. So that's my kind of vision for this. If that doesn't sound a bit too fuzzy. So what are the implications of that? Well, the implications are, I think we make psychology really part of that developmental journey. We bring it to life. It goes from being something where you'd maybe read a PDF online or watch a video, to something which is very personal. It's about you, it's on demand, it's dynamic, it's something that you can use as part of your own personal kind of journey through football. So for me, that's what would be really nice, and the possible scaling up of that would be, that's where the potential lies. How good would it be if young players could get that kind of support across disciplines, not just psychology, but across all disciplines. So that if you're a footballer and you're trying to take your football seriously, or it's important to you, there are ways that you can develop when you're not on the pitch all the time. So hopefully that sounds okay to you.
Yeah, I love that. No, it's almost like a Dragon's Den pitch. It sounds awesome. And I think a couple of points you sort of made about not taking that time away from being on the pitch is really important, because those maybe 3 hours a week that a young person can get if they're in grassroots of playing on the pitch are so vital, just often to their mental health, of being with their mates. So not taking away from that, and yeah, that interactive approach and sort of ease of just getting it on your phone. Just one question on that is: are you aware of any application or anything out there that's currently in use, or that people are able to access sort of along this idea, or is there no resource really available to everyone out there currently?
I think there is really an app for everything these days, but again, that's what the industry partners, part of my PhD, is wanting to try and pursue and really capture. And I think their approach, which is commendable, is to use people like myself doing PhDs. So there's real relevant research which backs up what they're doing and why they're doing it. I think it'd probably be quite easy for anyone to code an app which allows a player to log their reflections. Gets a bit more complex when you start to bring in some of that other stuff of, okay, how could you maybe get it where there's a bit of coach feedback can go into that, or where there are maybe kind of pre-recorded videos that they can access to sort of support some of that, or where there are ways that they can, interact with their peers and go, right, okay, did I manage to write a reflection on being resilient at training in the forthcoming week? Yep, tick box, right, okay, 80% of the team have done that. Oh, I've not done that, so I better get on it. When we start to kind of develop and expand some of those ideas, it then hopefully becomes something which is more of a unique product. Again, the usual tools for me doing sports psychology one-to-one are on my desk here. It's things like Post-it notes, pens, a couple of Sharpies. So you don't need huge amounts of technology to do sport psychology on that one-to-one level. But if we can make it a bit more fun for a generation who are used to having technology and information available in really short bursts, that kind of edutainment angle and stuff as well, then I think you're heading towards something which is hopefully really exciting and impactful.
Amazing, yeah. I think there's incredible scope with it, and moving forward as you sort of, I guess, get the results of this, there can be amazing steps taken with it.
Cool.
Thank you for sort of like discussing your PhD and what you're looking into. Just to move on to our sort of final section now, a bit about the BPS, the British Psychological Society. I know you've been doing a bit of work and been involved with them. So firstly, could you just give sort of a brief description of what it is, who they are, and what they do?
Yes, I was aware of the BPS when I first did my undergraduate degree as this, body which looks after psychology, in all different forms of educational counselling. You're aware of the BPS. When I decided to kind of pursue sports psychology, I decided that I wanted to get a bit more involved in what is the division of sport and exercise psychology. So it sort of sits in there as a member network underneath this broader umbrella of the British Psychological Society, who oversee all these qualifications and all the sort of professional recognition and certification of psychologists. So yeah, I guess my motive for getting involved was I kind of wanted to have a bit of a voice, have a bit of an input. I also wanted to find out, what's going on, have my finger on the pulse, what's happening in our field. I think originally I came on as just a sort of an ordinary co-opted member, which was really nice. Obviously, I had some faith put in me from some of my contemporaries on that initial committee, and then mostly through being co-opted, ended up taking on some different roles. So I was kind of communications lead for 1 year. At that point, I was just really keen to try and make sure that people knew that the Division of Sport and Exercise Psychology is a community. It's there for people to share opportunities to get together to try and make positive change happen for sport and exercise psychologists. That was then followed by being conference co-lead for a year, so working with my colleague Dr. Zoe Black, working up to hosting that conference. I was going to say competition, but hosting that conference in Edinburgh at the end of 2023. And most recently kind of coming in as a sort of secretary role to try and help a little bit with that transition for the new conference leads coming in. But yeah, I guess the point of that is there's loads of different opportunities. What drove me was I wanted to be part of and try and foster that sense of community so that we could have that collective voice. So when there are things happening in the sector, such as unqualified people calling themselves psychologists, we can stand up and challenge some of that. We can also celebrate the good work that we do and try and turn that story around from, team facing relegation, bringing sports psychologists to teams succeeding at European competition have been using a sports psychologist. So really kind of celebrating some of what we're doing as well. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour of what's going on.
Yeah, that's a really good overview, and you've been involved, I guess, in a few different roles, so you've got a good idea of how it works and what it can offer as well. I like that bit about sort of changing the idea of success, and we psychologists are involved when things are going really well as well, not just to try and sweep up the mess. You on your socials towards the end of last year, there was a huge amount about your involvement in the conference, and it did look like a really brilliant sort of success. Could you sort of explain just a little bit about what the conference involves, the planning of it, and sort of the benefits of it to members?
Of course, I think I'll share off a bit of a reflection. I remember in 2017, which was that midway point in my own MSc programme, the DSET conference was in Glasgow, which just seemed like a coincidence, really. I didn't pay for accommodation, but I signed up for, I'll go for the 2 days. And again, I think I was fortunate that I could get that time off work to go along, get that time off classes to go and attend at that point. And at that point, I felt a bit like a fish out of water, but actually go in there, I felt really comfortable and really enjoyed being part of that community with people with a shared interest. Everyone was fairly outgoing, fairly easy to connect with. I didn't even stay for any of the social activities at that point. I was just like, I'm going to go along, learn what I can, network a little bit. But actually, it was just a really nice environment. I just really enjoyed being part of it, and that shared passion kind of really came through, and start having lunch with other people and things. It just feels nice to be part of something. It's maybe a bit geeky and a bit niche, but yeah, that's how it came across to me. So obviously that was 2017. By the time 2023 was coming around, it hadn't been back in Scotland, and it had sort of toured a little bit. It had been over to Northern Ireland. It had been in Swansea in 2022. And it had been in a couple of locations in England as well as a COVID year. So my colleague and I decided it was time to try and bring it back to Edinburgh. So we shared the role on the proviso that we could bring it to Edinburgh. Not Glasgow, just mix things up a little bit. It was really exciting to be part of. It was really nice to be able to kind of basically had a wish list of keynote speakers. We got, I think, pretty much all of them. Just started off thinking, right, whose podcasts do we enjoy, who's out there, who's doing good work, invite them along, tried our best to coordinate and accommodate so many excellent abstract submissions so that there was a real buzz that people could come and share experiences of their research, share their applied practice, and obviously we factored in a really nice social activity as well, having ceilidh dancing, doing a wee pre-conference tour of our places of work and stuff as well, just to try and smash some worlds together and just allow people to come together and go, right, I'm doing this work, and we have people from Australia, for example, so I'm doing this work on this side of the globe, sharing some reflections with people in Scotland and the rest of the UK as well.
Excellent. That's really good to hear, and I think as someone hopefully hoping to sort of enter this environment and this space, hearing that it's such a sort of a welcoming and a positive environment is so good to hear, because it encourages you to go down that path. And as well, I think it's important, firstly, as being a psychologist, that you're supporting people, but also that it's it can be you're often working, maybe you're the only person or the only psychologist in your place of work, or you're working a lot of sort of individual client stuff that you've maybe not got that strong group of colleagues that you might do in other roles. So having that sort of wider network is really beneficial and positive.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose just to touch on that again, as mentioned right at the start, I've been involved in a few different sectors, different lines of work, and I guess everywhere has its pros and its cons, but that was something which resonated with me, compared to working and going to other conferences or going to other sort of collective things. What surprised me actually was that it wasn't ultra competitive. It didn't strike me as somewhere people were kind of fighting over the greatest accolades, or people weren't jostling to try and get the best opportunities. People were pretty open about the work they were doing too, and that's certainly something which I think is really important, because it's easy if you're doing research or applied practice to keep your cards super close to your chest. And I've learned loads from people not adopting that approach and being really honest and saying, here's some exercises that I do, here's what works, here's what doesn't work. And I think it's nice to hopefully give back in that way as well, because that's the only way we can progress our profession, is by almost being open source with it and sharing ideas and developing different approaches and ways of working. So yeah, I think that was really important as well.
Yeah, excellent to hear. And I guess it comes back to that open science idea, and psychology has been riddled with problems in recent history with the lack of that. So that's good to hear. That's sort of the approach. Look, Alban, we've covered so much today. So a massive thank you for your time, from sort of a bit of overview about your career, your initial successes and challenges in psychology, and then working as a performance psychologist in professional football. I know, as a sort of fan of football myself, it's so interesting to hear what goes on behind the scenes, and how you're involved in dealing and working with players. And then the PhD stuff is fascinating too. I think the work, especially at a grassroots level, and looking at what can be done and involved at that level is so key, and a brilliant way of taking that sort of next step in sports development. And then obviously the work with BPS. So a massive thank you for that. I've got one last question, which sort of
Great.
is for anyone, I guess, working in a football environment, or to be honest, a sporting environment, whether it's elite professional or a grassroots. What would be your sort of one piece of advice for someone who's wanting to involve or use a bit more sports psychology, whether they're a coach or wanting to involve it with their players? What's your one piece of advice for someone who's wanting to do that and maybe start on?
I think, to me, the most important thing is about understanding psychology isn't reinventing a wheel. It's actually done best when it's integrated into our current practices, and that might be something as simple as the timing and the way that we word questions to our players. At the start of a session, at the end of a session, how can we bring to life some of these concepts we've spoken about, like resilience? How are you going to be resilient in training today? Oh well, I'm going to try something new. Brilliant, great. Reflect on it afterwards as well. Can you give me some examples of when you were able to be resilient? So there are tiny little things that we can do, which I think have the biggest impact for bringing psychology to the fore. If we want players to be psychologically flexible, to have that psychosocial development as well. So yeah, that's probably my short answer for coaches and people wanting to use sports psychology. I think the other side of it is for people wanting to get into it as a career, as a domain. Probably goes back to the points I made earlier of, I personally think presence and patience are really important. Make sure that you are seen, make sure that you are able to take in as much of any environment as possible, but also be patient. It will take players time to, or any athlete really, to kind of understand and feel secure, and that feel there's a bit of a rapport with you. And I don't think we can rush that, because I think that ultimately limits the extent of the work that we can do. So yeah, get people curious about psychology, and then you're in a great opportunity to do some good work.
Wicked. Yeah, brilliant advice there. Awesome.
Hopefully.
Look, Alban, thank you again for your time today. I'm sure listeners will have really enjoyed this episode. I've gotten a huge amount of that myself, so I'm sure others will. So yeah, thank you again for joining us today.
No, absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for the invitation, George. And yeah, hopefully your listeners got one or two things out of that.